Welcome to this chess video. We've got a fun topic for this one, because here I have 5 different examples from my own games where there's a little bit of psychological trickery going on in the endgame. Now as you can see in this position here, black is definitely winning, and sometimes the endgame can allow you to set some traps even if you're ahead. Anything to end the game quicker is usually your benefit, just less chance that you'll make mistakes if you can simply end the game sooner, and if you're in an over-the-board tournament, it can also save you some mental energy so you aren't as burnt out for the next round. So in this position here, the very first example, I have just captured a piece on h4. Black is up 2 points of material, but it looks like we've accidentally blundered into this knight to d7. And so I might ask you, why would I allow this fork, which looks like it would give back the material? Now the toughest defense according to the engine here is actually playing the rook to d7, and then white has some really annoying counterplay attacking black's pawn and king here, as well as perhaps starting to go after these pawns. But in the heat of the endgame, sometimes the lower time, players can miss these things, and so here they play the very obvious looking fork to try and win back the material. Now this fails for a few different ways. The way that I was thinking in the game was getting out of it with this check first, and then I can perhaps save this rook. The engine recommendation is actually to start with this knight check first, and this is actually a forced checkmate in 9. You can forgive me for not calculating that far, but in the game this is completely winning, where I'll just play the rook over as a check. They must move, and now I can play my knight here for a check. They move their king, and not only am I saving my last rook, but letting them so-called fork my rooks allows me to play this, and I am simply threatening checkmate. There's no way to stop this from being checkmate. And so they tried the last thing they could, which is to just play this, hoping that I would pre-move this or something and then lose my rook. But after the recapture, they can give a check, I'll just move, and eventually they'll run out of checks and they simply cannot stop this rook move. If they were to try and play rook to h8 as the last try to stop it, then king g7 and they can't stay on this file without losing the rook. Now of course black was winning in this original position, so many moves were good. But sometimes thinking of what they can play as counterplay, such as this potential fork of the rooks, might be a good starting point to see, does that move actually work? And if their best idea of counterplay to the appearance is something that actually isn't really a threat, that can oftentimes be a really good starting point to set a trap. In this case, allowing the fork that wasn't really a threat, and then ending the game sooner compared to as if they had played a move like rook d7. Okay, so now for the second example. This one is a little bit more entertaining. I just had to include this one because it's just a really fun idea. Very similar to what we looked at, white is up 2 points of material, and so we are winning this endgame. Generally speaking, the 2 pieces are going to outperform the rook, and we also have an extra pawn, so we are definitely in the better here, as long as I don't lose one of my pieces. Now this knight is defended by my pawn, I just have to be careful that this piece doesn't ever fall for a tactic or end up hanging. So although there's many ways to win, very similar to what we looked at, what is a move that I could play that looks like it might lose material? Well, at a glance, I could try knight c6, and it looks like they'll win one of these pieces. Instead of playing for tricks here, if I go back, the top engine move is actually to play pawn h5, and then after that check, if they take my pawn, then I'll just take their pawn, and we continue to trade down in this endgame. But my little trap here could end things sooner if they fall for it. Now, I'm also setting a separate trap here. So first I'll explain why this does not work. If they were to play this move, I was planning to play this check, again defending my piece, and very similar to what we had last game where the check moves my rook, then I can now move my bishop and everything is actually safe. But in the process, we've corralled their king much. Look already here with this knight controlling these squares, the bishop now controlling here, and you can see their king is actually corralled. And it's not going to be too much more work before we can find some checkmate. Again, simple things to just make our job easier, especially here where we are down on time. But now there's a second trap that I've set with this, and this is actually the really entertaining one. Very often in the endgame, with lower time for both players, especially players in I'd say about roughly the 1400 to 1800 range, tend to really go after outposts, because they feel like at the very least they're not going to hang their piece, it'll just be defended by their pawn. And so in this case, it's actually tempting to play a move like rook to e4. But now rook e4 comes into this very interesting trap that we have in the game. Whereas by moving my knight, I now have this check, they move somewhere, and now I actually just entomb their piece. I play bishop to d4, a very funny looking idea, and long term, I just circle around as if that rook wasn't there, and play the endgame where they're simply helpless. The top engine idea is h5 and then trying to bring my king up this way. In the game, I didn't even want to risk that, because here my knight controls this square, the pawn controlling this square. I figured it was safer to simply move around the other way. And so the game actually continued like this, where they would try to shield me out. I slowly advance, and they really can't stop this. It's almost like a pawn endgame, as if the rook wasn't there. And now they can't go to this square because my knight controls it, and so this pawn will drop, and then I'll win the rook. Or they can sacrifice it for one of my minor pieces, but then the resulting pawn capture is going to make a pass pawn, and eventually a queen. Now, it might seem like some of these are just fun, tricky ideas, but as I said, there is a logic to it, because even the top players like Magnus Carlsen will often set traps in the endgame, especially when there's time pressure, and I think they can trick their opponent. It just makes good logical sense, because none of these moves were terrible, we didn't give up the advantage, but it gives our opponent a chance to go wrong and end the game sooner in our favor. Alright, now we get to a trap that looks sorta more like something Eric Rosen would come up with. Here, unfortunately, we are the white pieces, and so we have zero chance of winning this game. Best we can hope for is a draw. And very often I would resign in a position like this, but it really depends on how I think the opponent is playing. Now, as you can tell, I did not resign here. And there's a little bit of method to this. There's a psychology behind what I'm doing. I move my king, okay fine, but notice that they're taking roughly 3 to 5 seconds on each of their moves. Now by no means am I accusing my opponent of cheating, I think this was a fair game, but by taking a few extra seconds, it tells me they are not super confident in this. For me, I start pre-moving queen moves, because I can pre-move queen checkmate, but them taking a little longer to move tells me that I might actually have chances. Now I move further up, see where they go. And again, they play this queen to e3, which gives me hope. If they had played different moves, I might have considered resigning. I move back this way to make things a little more difficult, and now I come up and see where they go, and they go this way, which is objectively fine, but it looked a little bit strange the way they were approaching with their queen. It's not the safest way if you've practiced this against a bot. I've practiced this endgame a lot from the winning side, due to chess.com's endgame pawn drills, and it's a really good place to start if you have access to those. And if you don't, you can just take any fen position, set it up against the computer, and just play it over and over really quickly. It gives you good practice not only on how to win the endgame that seems so basic, but it helps keep your skills sharp so you can play this under time pressure. Now here, both of us have plenty of time, even my 21 seconds really isn't relevant here. But with over 3 minutes, you would think they would definitely be taking their time more than they are. Or they would be playing something really safe and just ending the game quickly. So I move back, and they're playing the riskier move here, where they play this queen to d3. Again, they haven't blown the win, but they're giving me chances to swindle. Because now when I go here, it looks natural to approach with the king. And then, of course, here comes the trap, where I go with this move. And I'm sure you guessed it by the topic of this video, that yes, they actually stalemated me. Plenty of time on their clock. There's really no excuse for doing this, but sometimes the heat of the moment, you fall for something like this. Even the best players have done it from time to time. I think starting with their king up was probably fine. But when I'm going this way, if you just want to play it really simple, you should just simply play queen e4 and keep this little box method going here, and you're just going to force me to checkmate, probably in this corner, or on one of the edges of the board. If you really know this endgame well, then you could also cut off the king this way, and start pushing me towards this direction where there's a little bit less room to work with, and you'll actually checkmate slightly faster. What really gives it away is more this position though, where when I'm moving this way, you really need to be moving your queen here and cutting me off as soon as possible. You can advance your king at your own pace, but you should probably lead with the queen and kind of keep this box right here very small and keep my king corralled. By leading with the king and then I move here, you're just giving me extra chances. And then, of course, we know that, unfortunately, in this case, it didn't work out. But let's go to another example now. Here's the fourth one of the video. And now this one is another endgame trickery kind of trap here. Because just like before, we are massively behind. I play these kind of endgame traps very often. This is not just handpicking a few great cases where I somehow swindled. Everyone makes those comebacks. But check my game archive. This happens very often. I'm not saying it happens every game, but maybe out of 100 games, this might happen maybe 2 or 3 times. It has to do with the mindset of thinking, how can I make this as difficult for them as possible, and trying to put up the best defense. And that applies to any stage of the game, but especially in the endgame where there's less margin for error. In this case, I'm in check, I have to move my king, and of course we are completely losing here. We are down by 11 points. They play here, which is a good move, and of course they're going to grab my pawn and start getting to my king. Now I move here. The reason being is because I want to make it kind of difficult, and maybe they might forget about this bishop. Controlling these squares might give me an extra stalemate idea. Now, I don't think they forgot about this bishop, but I want to see how they can corral my king efficiently. They play here. I move towards the corner. Now things get a little bit trickier because they come down, and already I've got the little signaling in my mind going here, thinking I can pull off some psychological trap. They're setting themselves up a little bit, because I have a really tricky idea. I can bring my bishop back here, of course helping prevent queen g7 checkmate, but there's also a very sneaky idea, which is they advance their pawn, and now I play bishop to f8. Looks like it's just a waiting move and I've got nothing, but notice if you promote to a queen or even a rook, in this case they went queen, well, this is actually a stalemate because now I've willingly pinned my own piece. And they probably forgot in this case about the bishop controlling this square. They probably thought I could move here and then it would be checkmate on the very next move. So as entertaining as this might be to look at, there is something to be learned here. Think of the psychology behind this. If I had just a king, maybe you would think, oh, there might be stalemate tricks, I gotta be careful for it. But I still have a piece on the board. And especially often, if you have pawns, multiple pieces, there's almost no chance for stalemate in their mind, and so they just eliminate the possibility without actually giving it thought. If you look at some of the best endgame defenses, there are some real cool endgame fortresses you can set up with weird configurations of pieces and trapping your own king. This is really no different, it's just a simplified version of it, where your opponent is less likely to be thinking stalemate, and that sets them up in a vulnerable situation where if you can come up with this ingenious idea, you might be able to trick them. Now I have at least half a dozen examples I could share in addition to all this. These are just a tip of the iceberg. As I said, it happens fairly often, but I think for this video I'll only share one more example. This one is probably one of my favorite weird swindles of all time. This one I am down by 8 points, and so a draw would be a good result. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is when you're down by this much, if you're down by 8, if you're down by 18, it really doesn't matter. Might as well be down 1,000,000. What matters is how much counterplay you have, and do you have the ability to kind of set up some tricks. In this situation, what I realized was that they are up by a ton, and if I want to get stalemate, or some tricky idea, I might want to be giving up material. It just makes it less pieces I have that have legal moves. I might be able to set up something. So I play this rook to e3. They do capture it, I capture back. And of course you could just say I'm just getting rid of pieces, but there's a little bit of trickiness here. Because the reason I haven't resigned is if you look at their king, it's extremely cut off, right? And we also have the bishop here. This bishop is anchored. They have no legal moves. And so already, if I can just find one way to give a check, that'll actually be checkmate. And so they bring their knight back to c3. But now I think, okay, well, what checkmate square could I give? Well, I only have the knight left, right? Because the rook and bishop are already involved in this mating net around the king. So I must be able to give a check with the knight. Now, where can I do that logically from? Well, there's this square, but their bishop might move, and then the rook is controlling there. And so really the optimal square I can start planning is how to get a knight to here. Now, there's a few ways, but the shortest route is to take 4 moves. And so the idea I was planning was starting with knight to c8. Then I can maybe get the knight here, here, and then finally to c5. Now this is like a 0 chance of losing because worst case scenario, we actually lose the game that we were already lost in. So really, what's the worst result that could happen? It's almost like a free roll that you can get a draw or a win at this point. So I move over here, they play g6, I continue with my plan, but they're not going to fall for this. And so now I have to think, well, there's a little thing I have to do first. I don't want to play this immediately. Very obvious they'll either just take it, or I have to worry about this move promoting coming with check. And so I first play king to a7, getting the king out of the way, the potential check, but I'm also doing one other thing. I'm intentionally waiting for their pawn to get to g7. And there's a little bit of psychological trickery here, because when they played to g7, now I can try knight d7. And of course, they could take this and I'm simply losing. But the reason I play it here, and not the move earlier, is because now they are one move away from promoting. If we go back a bit, you will notice that I can play my knight here, but they are a lot less likely to miss the knight if they just have the threat of pushing a pawn. So pushing the pawn is really no big deal. That can be played at any time. But the extra anticipation of promoting, well, that's a much bigger threat. Right now, getting a queen, this is just something people immediately do without thinking. And so when I play here, you can guess it, they do promote to a queen. They really should have finished me off a long time ago. And now I actually play the very unexpected of them, I'm sure. Knight c5, not just a draw, but this is actually a weird checkmate. So actually waiting one move there helped me pull this off. I think that if I had done this one move earlier, they would have seen it. But by intentionally waiting until their pawn was on g7, and it was also useful to get my king out of the way, I'm setting them up for the potential chance of promoting and then overlooking the move that ends in checkmate. So very often when you're in a losing position, you have to really think, how can I possibly win this or salvage this? What is something they could reasonably miss? And I think it's really that mindset of approaching things to make it really tough on your opponent that really helps you in all stages of the game. It's a mindset that really happens beginning, middle, and end of the game. All the phases, you can be thinking this and start setting traps for the opponent. Maybe it won't be as simple as stalemate, but the idea of thinking of your opponent's counterplay and how to make it as difficult for them as possible to convert is something that's really transferable to all parts of the game. Let me know if this entertaining video was fun, and if you want to see more endgames similar to this, or even some opening or middle game positions where I trick my opponents in similar ways. I have another psychology type video planned, but that one is a little bit more serious, so if you want to get a little more insight into how you can pull off some of these ideas, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for what's to come. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.